Hello, I wanted to talk to you about the brain anatomy. I wanted to break this down so it's fairly simple for you to be able to identify some of the structures in the brain without too much of a headache. Ha ha ha. So there's four main parts to the brain that you're going to need to know. If you separate the brain into four different parts, then it's going to make it a lot easier to break it down and identify the structures within each part. So first you have the cerebrum, and then you have the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the brainstem. So the cerebrum is this whole exterior part up here with all the wrinkles, the wrinkly part of the brain, and that is called the cerebrum. This is called the cerebrum, this whole wrinkly part of it. Wrinkle, wrinkle, wrinkle. And then at the base of the cerebrum, you have this structure here, and the structure underneath it, and the little structure underneath it, and we'll go more into that stuff later. Underneath the cerebrum, you have the diencephalon, which is this portion right here. I'll highlight all or identify, circle all of this pink in the very middle here, and it goes all the way out to the pituitary gland that's dropped down there, and then you follow the pink back up, this little pink circle in the middle. All of this is the diencephalon. So I'll put a big D there. So that's the diencephalon. The cerebellum is this little part back here, and this is in the back. Here's the back. Here's the front, or the face. Here's where your face would be. Here's the nose. And cerebellum means little brain. And see how it looks like a little tiny brain? It looks like a little mini-me of a brain. Underneath the diencephalon, and to the left, to the front, the anterior portion of the cerebellum, you have this entire area right here that comes down, and this whole area is called the brainstem. And we'll get a chance to see this stuff isolated by itself, so you can make sure that you understand what you're looking at. So pretty much the brain there's four sections to the brain, and if you draw it out, forgive my drawing, but if you draw it out, the top section looks like a bicycle helmet, and then underneath the bicycle helmet there's a little mini brain. In the center of the bicycle helmet, underneath it, there's like a ball right here. And then beneath the ball, there's a stem that's got bumps on it. Here's bumps on the back, and then a bump, and then a bump. And it goes down. So this is four sections. Section 1 would be the cerebellum, or cerebrum, sorry, cerebrum. And that's the wrinkly area. And then this little ball in the middle, or here, let's do the cerebellum. The cerebellum is little brain. And that's in the back. Then the ball in the middle is the diencephalon. And the thing about the diencephalon, di means two, the number 2, and then encephal just means head, and on just means pertaining to. And then down here, this whole little stem is obviously going to be the brainstem. And that goes down until it turns into, right about here, it turns into the spinal cord. And then, so that continues down through your vertebrae. Here's the brainstem just by itself. Actually, it's not by itself because this pink area up here, this whole pink area, this is part of the diencephalon. This is called the thalamus. And I'll show you what that looks like in the whole brain in a little bit. But that's the thalamus is part of the diencephalon. Other than the thalamus, the rest of this, see this green part? I'll highlight this in green, this green area right around here. And then this part down here, this that has the bump in the front, this is the front, this is the back. We're looking at a side view of this. So this blue, this whole blue area right here underneath the green, there is this orange area right below this blue. And that kind of has a bump too in the front, not as prominent as the blue up above it. And then down here is the spinal cord. I'll draw a line of demarcation there. So the rest of this is the spinal cord. What I want to draw your attention to real quick is this thalamus up here, this pink part. This is part of the diencephalon, so this is not part of the brainstem. So let's look and see if this was removed, what it would kind of look like. There we go. So that's the brainstem with the diencephalon removed from the top of it, or the thalamus removed off of the top of it. At the very top there, you're going to see this green structure, and this green structure is going to be the midbrain. And that makes sense because it's in the middle of your brain. It's right beneath the diencephalon, which is the big ball underneath the bicycle helmet when I drew that. And the midbrain is the middle part, and it's the top of the brainstem. Then right below the midbrain there's this very prominent bump. There's this big, huge bump. And again, this is the front. You're looking at the side view of this. This big, huge bump right here, this blue section, this is going to be the pons. I have no idea why it's called the pons. Just remember it's called the pons. Now this red beneath it, always makes me think of an Adam Sandler movie.
Now, is there anyone here that can tell me why most alligators are abnormally aggressive?
I know the answer to this question. Raise your hand.
Anybody? Anyone? Yes or you, sir?
Mama says that alligators are ornery because they got all them teeth but no toothbrush.
Your mama said alligators are ornery because they got all them teeth and no toothbrush. Wow. Anybody else? Yes sir, you, sir?
Alligators are aggressive because of an enlarged medulla oblongata. It's the sector of the brain which controls aggressive behavior.
That is correct. The medulla oblongata.
But Mama said...
The medulla oblongata is where anger, jealousy, and aggression come from. Now, is there anybody here can tell me where happiness comes from?
No.
Anyone?
Oh.
All right. Let's hear what Mama has to say on the subject.
Mama say that happiness is from magic rays of sunshine that come down when you're feeling blue.
Well, folks, Mama's wrong again.
No, Colonel Sanders, you're wrong. Mama's right.
Mama's right. Mama's right. Something wrong with his medulla oblongata.
because it's called the medulla oblongata. And then down here, this is the spinal cord. This is the beginning of the spinal cord, at the top of the spinal cord, and then it goes down through the vertebra. Now this is a back view of what we were just looking at. So I'll put posterior view, posterior brainstem, posterior view. Now if you notice up here, here is the thalamus, which is part of the diencephalon. That's the thalamus, and that's not actually part of the brainstem. It looks like a mushroom cap almost on the top, but that's part of the diencephalon. That's what we removed in order to see the brainstem in the last slide. Now this green part, once again, this is the back view again. And what we were looking at before, we were looking at if we cut this down the middle, right here. If we had sliced this down the middle like this, we were looking at the side view of the brain cut in half sagittally. But now this is the back, this is the entire back view, the posterior view. So this is both halves of the brainstem put together. And this green part is the midbrain. I just want to go over this again with you because I want you to see the back of it. And then below the midbrain, remember it had that very prominent bump in the front, but we're not looking at the front, we're looking at the back now, so we're not going to notice that. But this blue section is the pons. This red section, this is the back of the red section, and this is the medulla oblongata. And then of course this leftover down here, that is the spinal cord. Because after the medulla oblongata, it turns into the spinal cord. Now here's a close-up of the midbrain, of what, this is the same picture that we just looked at, but I zoomed in so you could see a close-up of the midbrain. Now this up here, at the top up here, this stuff, that is the part of that mushroom cap. That's the thalamus. So the thalamus actually isn't part of the brainstem. The thalamus is part of the diencephalon. But this green part, this green section down here, is the midbrain. And the reason why I wanted you to see this posterior view of the midbrain up close is because there's these structures on the back of the midbrain that you're probably going to need to know. At least I had to learn them. Now, if you notice, there's these, they look like bumps, these green bumps. These other structures underneath that look kind of half-toned, those are inside the structure. So we're going to ignore those for a minute, and we're just going to look at these major bumps that come out here. See this? Here's one. And here's one. These bumps stick out of the back of the midbrain, and they're called the corpora quadrigimina. Now, the reason why they're called that is quad obviously is going to mean 4. Gemin or gemina means twins. So there's 2 sets of twins, which equals 4. So when we looked at the brain itself, it was divided down the middle like this, and we were looking at the side view. But see, this is the back view. So when you look at the side view, you're only going to see 2 of these. You're going to see the superior superior, and here's a superior, and here's an inferior, and an inferior. So you're only going to see one set of these. You're going to see a superior and inferior on one side, and then on the other side is the other superior and inferior. Now when they're individually, when you call them individually, you don't call them a superior corpora quadrigemina. The corpora quadrigemina is what you call it when you're referring to all four of them at once. But when you're referring to them individually, they're called colliculi. So there is a left superior colliculi and a right superior colliculi, and then there is a left and a right inferior colliculi. And the colliculi have to do with your reflexes. So the superior is visual. Let me get a different color for this. So the superior is visual, and the inferior is your hearing. So the superior, and these have to do with reflexes. So pretty much like if somebody jumps out right in front of you, you're going to blink and you're going to react. You're going to have a knee-jerk reaction. You're going to startle because of something visual coming up in your face really fast. So that is controlled by these superior colliculi, both of these superior colliculi. And then the inferior has to do with hearing. So if like somebody were to come up behind you, sneak up behind you, and then clap their hands really loud, and you jump 3 feet, and you'd be like, "Why are you sneaking up on me?" That startled reaction is from the inferior colliculi. So superior is visual, inferior is from your hearing. It makes you startle. And that's all part of the midbrain. So don't forget, this is part of the midbrain. Looking at this from the side, and this has been dissected sagittally. So this is divided right smack dab down the center. And so your face would be over here, and your back of your head would be over here. So here is another picture. Here is your diencephalon and your brainstem, and the diencephalon actually has a little hat on top of it, and I'll explain what those structures are also. So here's your model of your brain again, and this is a really good model that a lot of teachers in anatomy and physiology use, so I'm using this one. Now if we take away the cerebellum, the mini brain in the back, let's just black this out. We're going to take away the cerebellum, take away the pink stuff, the pink wrinkly stuff, the cerebrum. We're going to take all of this away, and that's the cerebrum. And then there's this other set of structures up here that looks kind of like, I mean, not a rainbow, but it's kind of in the shape of a rainbow. You have this one right here, this white thing. There's this pink thing that comes right next to it, and then another white thing that comes next to it, and then there's this blue thing that comes next to it. So all of those together are kind of what attaches the cerebrum to the diencephalon. So, and we'll get to these in a minute. And I just want to call this, right now, we're going to call this the hat, because this is the hat that goes on top of the diencephalon, and you'll see that in a minute. The diencephalon is this section right here. And then underneath the diencephalon is going to be the brainstem. Oh, and let me draw your attention just really quickly to on the brainstem, the top part of the green, this is the midbrain right here. Here's your midbrain, right? Because it's in the middle of your brain. and that's part of the brainstem. If you look back here, you can see two bumps. See these two little bumps? So those two little bumps are half of the corpora quadrigemina, or they're called the superior and inferior colliculi. So this is the superior, this is the inferior. Remember, superior is visual, inferior is hearing. And these are two, since this brain is divided in half, we're only looking at two of them. If you were to put the other half back on, there would be four of them in a cluster. And here's what it looks like with the hat on. And I always think when you actually look at it, it looks like a seahorse with a hat. So you see this up here, we have this. And then we have this section right here, this little pink section. And then we have another little white groove right there, and then this blue swirl. So this blue swirl. So those four things, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those four things are not technically part of the diencephalon. The diencephalon, once again, would be this pink structure and this big circle right here, and it comes out to here where it looks like a lizard's tongue, and it comes back here where this little pink thing's sticking out, and that's the diencephalon. So let's look and see what it looks like without the hat. See, now I think it looks like a little seahorse. So here would be the diencephalon, would be up here. Oops, and I overreached there. Here's where it cuts off, because here's where the midbrain starts. And here's the two little bumps in the back, the colliculi, the superior and inferior colliculi that I was telling you about for your startling reflexes. So that's the midbrain. And then this big, huge bump right here is the pons. And then this littler bump right here is the medulla oblongata. And then it comes down to about here. And then this is the spinal cord. Okay, now back to the the seahorse with the hat on it. So let's actually identify some of these diencephalon structures. Okay. Now up here in the diencephalon, first, here's where the midbrain ends. Oops, that was too messy because I'm going to need to get in there. So here's where the midbrain ends. There, we'll do it like that. And actually the midbrain would follow this white pattern out here. Sorry about that. So this whole thing would be the midbrain. Okay, so that's the midbrain. So this diencephalon is going to be this whole section up here, including this little pink ribbon looking thing, but not including that blue. And we'll get to that blue in a minute. We're going to look at this teeny tiny little dark notch looking thing in the very middle. Do you see that? So that teeny tiny looking thing is just called the interthalamic adhesion. Around the interthalamic adhesion, that little dot, this entire bump, there's a big bump right here. This whole circle that I'm circling in purple, this whole circle thing right here, that is the thalamus. See this pink ribbon on top of the thalamus? There's this pink worm looking thing that comes all the way down and sort of has a little crook under it. Comes all the way down. See this pink ribbon that goes on top of the thalamus right here? I'm highlighting it in red. And it comes back all the way down. This is called the epithalamus. Because why? Because epi means above. So epithalamus, above the thalamus. So this little pink looking ribbon, I'm coloring it in red now, is right above the thalamus. So that's called the epithalamus, for above the thalamus. Now below the thalamus, there's all this tissue down here, and it comes out to the left in this big triangle. If you look at this triangle here that I'm trying to highlight, and it looks like a lizard tongue. It comes down and it makes this white gets in the way. It looks kind of like this little lizard tongue because it's divided right there. And it comes all the way down underneath the thalamus, this tissue underneath and to the front of the thalamus that I'm coloring in green. So this is underneath the thalamus. So this would be called the hypothalamus, because hypo means under. There's a couple more structures I want to show you. And if you look at the this picture of it, here is the diencephalon. Here's the thalamus. Here's the hypothalamus. And then this pink ribbon up here that I'm coloring green that's coming down here is the epithalamus. Now there's some other stuff you need to know about this. If you follow the epithalamus, remember the green, the one that's on top of the thalamus is epithalamus. If you follow this all the way down around over the thalamus to the back, and it kind of makes this little angular turn right down here at the end of the epithalamus. So at the end of the epithalamus, at the end of this pink ribbon on the model, this is your pineal gland. And that's in the back. And then you notice right beneath the pineal gland are those little bumps that we were talking about for the midbrain, the corpus or the corpora quadrigemina, the colliculi, the superior and inferior colliculi. But that's from the midbrain, which is down here. Oh, oops, midbrain, right here. But right above those colliculi is where the epithalamus, the little pink ribbon, ends in an angle, and that is called the pineal gland. Now if you look over here at the hypothalamus, the red that's underneath the thalamus, hypo means under, so underneath the thalamus, and it comes out in this little lizard tongue looking split on the edge there in the front. And right where this splits right here, normally this is just a model, this is a picture of a model, and normally in the brain it's just missing the pituitary gland. But normally it would, this hypothalamus would come down to the end here, and there would be this little tiny stalk, like a celery stalk or a stem for a flower, and then this little bean hanging down here. So hypothalamus comes down to the end of the hypothalamus, and this little stalk would come off, and this little bean would hang off of the stalk. Now the stalk is a fun word. It's called an infundibulum. I'm in the club and I'm having fun. Infundibulum. And the little bean that's hanging off of the infundibulum is the pituitary gland. What about the stuff on top of the diencephalon? Because if I were to draw a line of demarcation between the diencephalon and the cerebrum, it would be like right here. So here's the diencephalon, and it comes down like this. So what's above the diencephalon? Well, first, there's this blue thing, this blue ribbon looking thing that comes on top of the epithalamus. So this is blue because these are vessels. And I'm showing you the top half of this brain also cut off because you can see these vessels actually go inside and they continue over here. They come out, they go on the side, and they actually branch out. These vessels all branch out inside the middle of the brain, or right above the diencephalon. See all of this? So this network of vessels that's blue, that looks blue, is called the choroid plexus. And a plexus just means a network. So there's this mesh of vessels that are all bunched together, and that's called the choroid plexus. And the choroid plexus is going to be really important when you're looking at the cerebrospinal fluid and all of that stuff. So keep that in the back of your mind. That's this blue thing. Now, above the blue is this white stripe, this little white thing coming down. This white stripe above the blue, that's called the fornix. Fornix. Above that, there's this part of, you can see on here, part of this this tissue right here. This tissue is actually very thin, and if you look right behind the tissue, right there, you'd see a hole. And if you were looking on the other side of this brain, on the other side of this tissue, you'd see another hole. And the tissue is what separates these two holes, one on the left and one on the right. Those holes are called the lateral ventricles. And the tissue that separates them, that I've colored in black right now, is called the, let's see, this tissue is called the septum pellucidum. I don't know why about the pellucidum, but septum is kind of obvious. Septum is like the halfway mark, like a tissue that separates one half from the other. Like you have a septum in your nose, down the middle of your nose. So this is the septum down the middle of your brain that separates your right and left ventricle. So there's space on either side of this tissue. Now here is a real brain. So let's try to just look at this brain and try to identify the major markers of this brain. So obviously this whole wrinkled area is the cerebrum. Now here's the septum pellucidum. This is what I was talking about that divided the lateral ventricles. So over here is a space, is a cavity in the brain, and that's your left lateral ventricle. And then on the other side of this septum pellucidum, you could actually like punch through it and you would end up in another room, in another cavity, and that would be your right ventricle. Now above the septum pellucidum, we didn't have a chance to go over, is this big white arch that goes over. And this big white arch is actually the connecting point of the two hemispheres of the brain, like the physical connecting point. And this is called the corpus callosum. This big white structure, this would be the corpus callosum. And then this right here, this section, that is a tissue that separates the right from the left ventricle, and that is called the septum pellucidum. Then this white little section that comes down below the septum pellucidum is called the fornix. And this blue section is, remember, those are vessels. It's blue because there's a whole bunch of vessels networked together, and it goes deep into the middle of the brain. And that structure of the network of vessels only just comes out right here, so you can see it, but it's a lot more vast inside the brain. And that is called the choroid plexus. And a plexus just means a network. Underneath the choroid plexus, you have this little pink ribbon looking thing. This pink ribbon is above the thalamus, so it's called the epithalamus. You get down to the end of this pink ribbon down here, and where it turns under right here, the little edge, the little end of the epithalamus, that is your pineal gland. Now this big, underneath the epithalamus is this big bump, and that's the thalamus. Underneath the thalamus is this whole piece of tissue, and that's the hypothalamus, meaning under the thalamus. And right here where the hypothalamus ends, there's this little lizard tongue white part right here is called the optic chiasm, because the optic nerve comes out here, but you'll learn that when you learn the cranial nerves. But also, right down here, not on this model, but normally, would be this little stalk called the infundibulum, and this little bean, it looks like a little kidney bean hanging down, and that's your pituitary gland. Beneath that is your midbrain, your pons, your medulla oblongata, and here's the little brain in the back. That's your cerebellum, meaning little brain. And then this whole pink wrinkled mess is your cerebrum. Here is your cerebellum, a close-up of your cerebellum, because I just wanted to point out a few structures. Inside the cerebellum, there are these white things that branch up like trees. And they come out, and they really, when you look at the brain, it looks like a bunch of branches, a bunch of tree branches in winter with no leaves on them. And they come out and branch out, and they're white. And in the models, they're white, and in your brain, they're kind of white also. And these tree branches are called arbor vitae. See, arbor for trees and vitae for branches. So they literally mean in Latin tree branches because they look like tree branches. Now, this other section around the tree branches, you see how there's this gray matter, just like the big brain, there's this gray matter that kind of folds around the exterior part of the tree branches. This gray matter is called folia.